Welcome to the Humans of Hospitality podcast. I know so many of you listening to this show love your local bar, your local restaurant, maybe your local hotel, and have so many fond memories of time in hospitality businesses. This is the podcast where we get to chat to the human beings behind the scenes of that industry. Maybe the chefs or the bakers or the coffee roasters or the gin distillers or the craft brewers or the entrepreneurs, but all doing an amazing job of making sure that hospitality stays interesting and the big, dull, formulaic brands do not take over our high street. Please enjoy the show. In this week's conversation, we are chatting to Simon from Hattingley Valley Wines. Now, if you'd said to Simon Robinson in 2008 that his Hattingley Valley vineyards would have the capacity in a really good year to produce 580,000 bottles of wine, or that his sparkling rosé would be crowned a world champion, he would have said you were absolutely crackers. And yet here we are, in just over a decade, Hattingley, and to be fair, other GB newcomers, have done brilliantly in what is a very old traditional industry, even though in the early days our efforts were written off as being poor copies of German varieties like Riesling and Muller-Thergau. In this conversation, you'll discover why, finally, our English sparkling wines are now doing so well, and why Simon calls his sector agriculture on steroids. It'll make your eyes water when you do, and you'll wonder why on earth he gave up his partner position at a city law firm to go on such a roller coaster. But I personally was very fascinated and very excited to finally get my head round the English wine scene and why not only are we catching up with our older European partners, but in many ways with innovation and speed of learning, we're taking over. I very much hope you enjoy this week's wine-inspired conversation. Thank you. Simon Robinson from Hattingley, thank you so much for sparing the time to let me come and have a chat with you.
Morning, Tom. Lovely to meet you.
And likewise. So I've done a few of these. I've been doing these a couple of months. And one of my favourite things, apart from meeting incredibly interesting people, is that I'm getting to see so much of the UK countryside. Can you just explain where in the world are we? Because it's a beautiful part of the country.
We're right in the middle of Hampshire. I'm not sure beautiful is possibly the right description right now, because we had the most appalling weather for the last 24 hours. But when the sun comes out again, as I'm assured it will, it is a beautiful spot between Winchester and Basingstoke and Alton in the other direction. So we're right in the countryside. Beautiful, lovely Hampshire rolling hills. Great.
Yeah. And we're at your winery, and I would describe this as a boardroom or all sorts of rooms.
Tasting room, we call it. Although it does act as a boardroom, meeting room.
Excellent.
And recording studio at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And the vineyards near here as well, because this is
they're about a mile and a half away. Although we actually take grapes from about over 20 growers now across the whole of the south of England. So we grow our own, we manage a vineyard, and we've got lots of other suppliers as well.
Amazing.
Mostly Sussex and Hampshire, but we have some in Essex. We have one in Dorset. Kent, all over the south of England.
Good. Well, I'm very excited to be able to come and have a conversation about what's been happening, both with Hattingley, but also just the UK wine scene in general, and we'll get into some detail about that, and we'll definitely come back to the weather, because that's my eternal challenge in running restaurants, and yours even more so, I think.
I think even more so, probably.
I don't know how you cope with the roller coaster, but we'll come to it. But before we do, can you just explain what was your background pre-Hattingley?
Well, I was a lawyer up in the city for 30 odd years, and a commercial farmer down here. We still run a commercial farm, mostly arable, but my eldest son runs a livestock operation for us as well. And it was the genesis of Hattingley actually comes from the farm. We were about, I suppose, the late 90s, early noughties. The wheat price was low, about £60 a tonne, and we were looking for diversification. I'd always had an interest in wine. I mean, lots and lots of people can say that, but probably a little more than an enthusiastic amateur, but
You
not
took it
much
to an
more.
extreme, didn't you? So
But took it slightly to an extreme. It did go back a long way. So we did a bit of soil sampling, and in 2008 we planted our vineyard. Of course, the great what if of that history is if the wheat price had been £200 a tonne as it was 5 years later, would we have done it at all? We'll never know that.
wow, that's a huge change in price, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I mean, it came back a long way from there. In fact, I don't think it ever quite got to 200. It was about 180, 190 at one point. And now I think it's probably about 140. So,
With the adventure that you've had, which we're going to come to, are you pleased it dropped down that low, or are you thinking, my goodness, that would have been an easier life, just sticking to
it would have
wheat?
been an easier life, yes, that's for sure. And more importantly, a less variable life in terms of yields. On the other hand, it wouldn't have been nearly so interesting. It's been a fantastic journey that we've been on, and not one that I planned to do to nearly the extent it's become. If you told me 10 years ago what we would be doing today as a winery, I'd have said you were completely crackers, frankly.
Yeah, that's often the case, and it just takes that first step. So if you planted your first vineyards in 2008, when did you actually start thinking about whether doing this commercially? What year was this? Did this journey start?
I always said it had to be a commercial venture because I work on the basis that something like this, if it's not commercial and you're having to fund it, it's not going to last. Even if you don't get bored with financing it, you can be rest assured your children probably will. And so you might as well not bother, frankly. So it was always going to be a commercial venture. It's just grown to a scale that we never anticipated. It's been it's been a great journey.
Yeah. So when you started, early 2000, presumably, what was the state of the English wine? Was there an English wine scene at that time?
Yes, there was. And English wine in the late 90s, early 2000s had you might say, a certain reputation, and not, frankly, a very good one. But something had started happening, and this is really what triggered the interest as much as anything. In the very late 80s, early 90s, one of our main competitors today, Timber, under the original owners, Stuart and Sandy Moss, had decided that they would start making, in essence, champagne. Obviously, none of the sparkling wine producers here can call their wine champagne. But they decided that the soil in the UK and the climate was very similar to the soil and climate that is in Champagne itself. And they're quite right about that, although we'll probably come on to that a little later. And that implied to them that it would be sensible for UK producers to be making sparkling wine from Champagne varieties. Now, that was a big change because in earlier years, if you went back 20, 30, 40 years even, I think probably what happened was that post-war, some servicemen came back and decided they wanted a quiet life in the countryside, or maybe they'd got a bit of land, who knows. And they thought that growing grapes and making wine would be a nice, gentle way of passing their time. And they looked across to North Germany, and they decided to plant the North German varieties, the Muller-Thergaus, Sylvaner, the Rieslings, and so on and so forth. And it didn't work. And interestingly, I've heard, or I haven't actually researched this, but I'm told that New Zealand made very much the same mistake, and it wasn't until later that they started planting much more successful varieties. And the reputation that English wine had by the late 90s was based on the still wine that people were making from the North German varieties. And the problem, of course, is that in North Germany you do get some long, hot summers, so the grapes mature properly, whereas it tends to be more of a rarity here. And the Champagne method is designed specifically to deal with what in the southern France or Australia or California or most parts of the world would be regarded as immature grapes. In other words, they're quite low in sugar by their standards and quite high in acids. And it's the same in Champagne. Champagne is a terrible place to grow grapes. Not terrible, that's slightly too strong, but it's not a great place to grow grapes. The most northerly part of France, which grows good grapes, a still wine, is really Burgundy. And that's one of the reasons you don't get, or haven't until recently, and this may change, of course, with climate change, you don't get still champagnes. So that's the history of what's been going on.
And why is Champagne presumably more forgiving? Why can you make good champagne from immature grapes that you can't make still wine from?
There's a whole variety of reasons, actually, none of which alone are the answer, but together create it. First and foremost, when people drink champagne or our sparkling wine, they expect a certain acidity in the taste. So consumers have in effect been trained over centuries to enjoy that just slight sharpness, which in a Burgundy red or white, they really wouldn't expect to taste. So that's the first thing. But there are lots of other little techniques that we have. We will use, for example, barrel fermentation, and probably more than most people would. Particularly at Hattingley, we've always been heavy on barrel fermentation. Now, why do I say that? Well, barrels will temper the flavour of the grapes, of the grape juice, and make it softer and more approachable. So there you've got the first, most obvious technique.
This is using barrels rather than using big
steel tanks, yeah. Right. We don't put everything through barrel, quite the reverse, and we judge it entirely according to the year and the quality of the vintage. So that some years it might be 30% of our classic will be barrel fermented. In other years it will only be 10%.
And you would blend that with the steel as well, or you have 100%?
No,
barrel fermented.
Nothing in this game is ever simple. Mostly it's blended with juice fermented in steel.
Right.
But we do one particular style of wine, which is our super premium wine, which is 100% barrel fermented. So barrel ferment is something that we are very strong on at Hattingley, and we think is a useful addition to the complexity of the wine, if you like. Second thing we do, people obviously know that you add yeast to grape juice to create alcohol, and it's the sugar in the grape juice that is converted. But you can also do a second fermentation. This isn't the one that creates the bubbles in the wine. This is, well, it's still in tank, or because this will only happen in steel fermentation. Which is called malolactic fermentation. And this is a bacterial fermentation where the malic acid in the grape juice, and malic acid is what you taste in apples. It's the green apple flavour that people talk about. The bacterial ferment converts that into lactic acid, which is a sort of softer, more gentle acid that you get in milk, hence the name. So malolactic fermentation is the second approach we use. And that, again, we don't put everything through mallow because we do want to retain some of the malic acids in there for the flavour. Again, it depends really on the year and the vintage, the quality of the grapes. The better the quality, the higher the sugars, the lower the natural acids, and therefore the less we need mallow. But it can be anything from, again, 30%, it's rarely more than 30%, to down to 5 or even 10 or even 5%.
Okay. And are these techniques you're talking about, is this the same as with the approach in the Champagne region? Is this a traditional approach, or are we having to adapt it for the UK?
Oh, yeah. No, this is well known. This is not a novel technique by any means. Right. What we do here, which is relatively novel, although again it came from Champagne, is doing the first two ferments, the alcoholic fermentation and the malolactic fermentation, at roughly the same time. And the reason we do that is for the malolactic, you have to heat the wine to get the mallow going. and you heat it to about 23, 24 degrees, which normally speaking you would think would be a bit of a disaster for the wine. But of course, with the alcoholic fermentation, that ferment creates heat. And so if we do them at the same time, we co-inoculate, as they say in the trade, you're using the ferment, the heat from the first fermentation, the alcoholic fermentation, to get the malolactic fermentation started. So that has some knock-on benefits as well. In particular, it creates a much fresher, fruitier wine, which is really what we want anyway. And of course, it's good for the planet, if you like, because we're not having to use energy to heat the wine the second time round.
Okay. So it all sounds very obvious when you say we look at northern France, in essence, to kind of choose the grapes rather than northern Germany, and clearly going south sounds obvious. Why did it take us? Presumably, we've been making wine, or we've been making wine in France for centuries. This is really quite new here, isn't it? Why did it take so long for us to cotton on? Because my understanding is that some of the soil in the Champagne region actually comes under the English Channel, and we've got similar chalky kind of, again, I'm quite naive on this kind of stuff, but from a historical conversation that we've got the right kind of, maybe slightly off on the climate, but we've got the right soil. Yeah, why the big delay for us to cotton onto this?
There's no answer to that. I've said on a number of occasions why we couldn't have done this 50 or 100 years ago. I have no idea. I guess the climate probably was less benign that long ago, but 40 years ago, I would have thought we could have been doing it 50 years ago. I think the honest answer is slightly historic. As you rightly say, until probably the early 80s, this was really a beer country. People didn't drink wine much. So the interest was amongst a few enthusiasts. I think perhaps more historically and prosaically, if you go back far enough in time, grapes were grown here and wine made in the Middle Ages, but it was nearly all made in the monasteries. And I think probably what happened, and if any historian listening to this disagrees, I'd love to hear from them, because I haven't really researched this, but it makes a lot of sense to me. When Henry VIII snatched the monasteries, the two things happened. First, the vineyards fell into disrepair because the monks were expelled from the monasteries. And of course, they were the ones who also had the expertise. So we started losing the expertise. And following on from that, you also had the mini ice age of the 17th century, when it clearly wouldn't have been a good idea to grow grapes. So by the beginning of the 18th, mid-19th century, we had no vineyards, no expertise, and as a beer drinking country, very little interest. There were one or two super enthusiasts. I think the Earl of Bute tried to plant one in Wales in the 1880s, but we're talking about one vineyard in the whole country, or maybe two. So I think probably the answer is historically. The other thing that I really can't answer is why it took Stuart and Sandy Moss, who were Americans, who happened to be living over here at the time, to decide that this was the way to go. So it wasn't even us that realised it was the way to go. Yeah. And Sandy Moss, I believe, had a history in the wine industry in California, which is probably why she latched on to what we should be doing.
Okay. Well, as a proud Brit, I love any opportunity to wind up our lovely French neighbours, I suppose, is good fun and exciting. So I'm super pleased that we decided to do it.
You're right, incidentally, about the soil.
Okay,
the chalk formation in Champagne does indeed reach across northern France, come under the Channel and comes up. And Hampshire is basically one big bed of chalk, and it's the same formation.
Really? Great. So we've learnt fast. We've learnt late, but we've learnt fast. We've kind of we've got the grapes. We've copied them. How are we doing from a quality perspective? Where are we at now?
We're right at the top of the quality curve. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And part of the reason, I think, is there's a number of reasons for this. We're not hidebound by the practices and regulations of the French and the Germans and the Italians who do, and the Spanish for that matter, who do have a tendency to say, well, this is the way we do it, this is the way we've always done it, and why would we change? And in many respects, why would you? So our natural tendency is also to look to the New World wine producers of Australia, New Zealand, California, Chile perhaps, and look at their techniques and say, well, why don't we do this and try it and see what happens. So innovation in this country is now, in the wine industry, is now very strong. Completely the converse of 25 years ago. And I suppose that's partly because the sort of people who go into it tend to be people who are going to say, not, we can't do that, but why shouldn't we? Let's see what happens. I have a phrase that I use in some of the tours we do around Hattingley, which is, I regard us as the new world in the old world. We're obviously in old Europe. Oh, well, sort of.
Don't even go there.
We won't go there, no. But in terms of our whole attitude towards winemaking, we're very much a new world producer. And this isn't just Hattingley, this is the whole industry in many respects. The other reason that quality becomes important is the one thing that we do suffer from here is relatively low yields in the vineyard, probably about half what are achieved in France. I mean, that's a gross generalisation.
Because of weather?
Because of the weather. Partly because of the weather, partly also because of the way we plant. We tend to plant slightly further apart, again, slightly to deal with the climate. We want as much sunlight as possible to fall on the grapes, so you don't want to plant the vines too close together. But also because we use tractors now, not horses, so you don't have to plant. You can plant them. You have to plant them slightly further apart to allow the tractors to go up and down. But that low yield has an impact on the cost of the product. And if you're going to charge more for your product, which we do, and we tend to price it, we're basically at the champagne prices, slightly below. In fact, with the movement in sterling recently, quite significantly below, which is helpful. But it does mean that we have to be a top quality product. That's the bad news. The good news is that because we have such a long growing season here, relatively cool climate, we can actually make really top quality products. And that's seen in the awards which English wines have been getting over the last 20 years. In fact, it was one of the things that first attracted my attention was one of the wineries got a gold medal in, I think it was a decanter award. And here at Hattingley, we've had, I don't wish to sound immodest, but we've had so many awards now, I don't even know how many it is over the years. But the two that I think stand out were the trophy for the finest sparkling finest sparkling rosé and the finest sparkling Blanc de Blanc in the world against all comers in the last couple of years. So
that's incredible, isn't it? How did that go down? Was that in the industry? Was that, and I mean not the UK industry, but the global? Were they kind of like, damn, those Brits coming in at the end and taking some glory? Did that make you chuckle, or is everybody in it together?
Dealing with the first one in the industry, it's the domestic industry. We're all delighted when people win awards because it only helps brand Britain, if you like. And at the moment, although English wines have become much better known in the UK than they were, there are still millions of people in this country who've never tasted a sparkling wine made here. There's an event we do in London, Taste, which is on in June this year. And when we had people come onto our stand, I always used to ask people, everyone, have you ever had an English wine before? And half of them said no. The other half, over half of them, couldn't remember what they'd had. So there's still a pretty significant degree of ignorance, even in this country. It's improving very rapidly, thankfully. Outside the UK, there's a puzzlement. People just find it difficult to believe that wine is made in England. And it's changing very quickly. It starts naturally enough in the trade itself. So if you go to America, which is our biggest export market, if you'd been there 5 years ago and asked any sommelier in America, I'd bet that 999 out of 1,000 would say that they don't make wine in England. That's not the case now. Most of them will have heard that it is being made. They may not have tasted it, but they will have heard it's being made. So we're gradually breaking the mould and getting out into the wider world.
I think it's really exciting. As a restaurateur who've always wanted to buy British where we can, so certainly with asparagus and strawberries and rhubarb and things that you can grow in England regularly. We follow that. Clearly our coffee and most of our wine doesn't come from England, but we've always wanted to support it. You're right. I mean, I've been doing it 14 years, and certainly in the early days, and again, I'll come back to still in a minute, but it was very difficult to justify the quality to price ratio on the menu. And even now, it's definitely changing, but still people's natural is just to go champagne, Prosecco. And where we need to put British sparkling on the menu at that price very close to champagne, it's still a challenge to get people to understand. So it's changing, but it's one of the key reasons of wanting to come and have this conversation, really, I think, is it's so exciting to see the recognition that we're now getting and the awards that we're now getting, and that genuine, before it felt a little bit like, support the underdog and buy British, and it's not quite as good and it's a bit expensive, but we'll get there. Now it's kind of like we can go, you know what, it's a really, really good product. Yes, you've got to pay for it. Are we going to be able to, and I suppose more so with Prosecco, I guess, but are we going to be able to get to the point where the yields in the UK mean we can compete a little bit more so that the restaurants can use it? Or do you think this is always going to be a very premium product because of the challenges of wine in the UK?
I don't think I know the answer to that question. It's not a price question, but the underlying point you make is, are we going to improve the yields? It is certainly something the industry would love to do and would love to approach. And there is research going on. Even at Hattingley, we've been doing our own little bits of research into this area. This is the sort of thing, because you're talking about growing seasons, it takes time. It won't happen in 2 years, suddenly decide, oh, that's the way to do it, we'll fix it. But if 10 years from now we've improved the yields, I mean, the starting point, interestingly enough, is probably not improving the absolute amount of yield, by which I mean getting from perhaps 3 tonnes an acre to 4 tonnes an acre, which of course would be a big improvement. It's more regulating the variability of the yield year on year, which is a direct result of the weather. What do I mean by that? Well, if you're growing wheat, you might get 3.5 to 4 tonnes an acre. In a good year, you might be up 10% or down 10%. Wine grapes are completely different. I call it agriculture on steroids, really. This is a slight simplification, but if you said the average yield in a good year, 2014 was what I would call a good year, we might get 3 tonnes an acre. And if you call that 100% yield, to give you an idea of the variability that we've had, 2010 was 100%, 2011 was 50%, 2012 was 0%. We lost the entire crop in 12. 13 and 14 were 100, 15, 16, 17 were 50, and 2018 was 180. Now, if we could get the yields at, shall we say, averaging 90% every year, that would make a big difference, obviously. So that's the first thing we'd like to do. If we can then get the yields up from 3 tonnes to 3.5 or 4 tonnes an acre, that'll make a further difference. I just caution slightly. I don't think we're ever going to get down to Prosecco type prices or Cava prices. I don't think we'd particularly want to, and because the quality of those are not generally particularly high. They're fine drinks, and I don't want people to think that I don't like people drinking Prosecco. Quite the contrary. I love people drinking Prosecco. I applaud them doing so, because drinking Prosecco is almost an entry-level sparkling wine. And if that introduces people to the joy and the fun of having bubbles in your wine, that's fine by me, because after a time, if even 10% of the Prosecco drinkers want something a little bit better and they find they can pay for it, with luck they'll come to us. They'll start, and that will boost our market. So Prosecco and Cava they have a place in the market, and that's fine by me.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think most people I've spoken to, whether it be coffee or whether it be craft beer makers, they all say the same thing. There's entry level, Starbucks is an entry level coffee that then leads you on to the more kind of premium coffee, the big national or international beers, maybe lead you into then learning a little bit more about hops and the kind of style of beers that you like, and hopefully lead to the micro producers. So I agree with that.
That's interesting. I hadn't heard that, but I can well believe it.
Yeah, well, I've only, like I say, been having these conversations for a couple of months, but it's similar themes come out. Much as I moan about the big kind of brands taking over the industry, people reassure me a little bit and kind of say, you know what, sometimes they are a stepping stone into that understanding, which then leads them on to the premium product. As a matter of interest, what happened in 2012 to get to 0%? Was this an early frost or something? What?
Actually, funnily enough, we didn't have an early frost in 2012, I don't think, but it was rather cold. We did have rain at flowering, which is the second big disaster. Our frost, late April frost is a real problem. Because it kills the buds, and we had that in 16 and 17. In 17, we lost 90% of the buds, but we got secondary buds coming through, so it became a 50% year. But there was some rain at flowering in 2012. But more importantly, it was just cold and damp, cold and damp all the way through, so the grapes just never matured.
Yeah, and realistically then, when you talk about innovation and research, I mean, how on earth can you research your way out of weather?
Well, there are things that, don't forget, we're not the only industry that has this sort of problem. Apples, strawberries, they all have weather issues, and they've developed some techniques which could possibly be adapted for grapes. Strawberries and a lot of the soft fruits are grown under polytunnels. Now, we can't do that with grapes, and we wouldn't particularly wish to, I don't think. But some of the ways that they heat those polytunnels might be adaptable for grapes, or you could possibly provide some kind of much more limited protection for the delicate parts of the vine. So it's watch this space. How can you do it? Well, if I knew that, I wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be out there doing it.
Yeah. Well, talking of which, so what's your impact of the nationally? What's your share of the UK wines? Is it GB Wines?
It's Wines of Great Britain Limited.
Wines of Great Britain. Yeah. Okay, perfect. So
which is the National Association of Producers.
Nice. And you're working together then to an extent. I imagine a number of those people are also your competitors, but you also join forces to represent Wine GB.
But the nice thing about the industry, although we do work together. Entirely proper ways, of course. I'm not saying that just we're very decent, proper about the way we do things. Partly, and that's not a problem, partly because everyone sees the success of somebody as a success for everybody. There will come a time when it becomes a much more competitive industry in the way that champagne or someone else is. But at the moment, we are so small, relatively speaking, that if I see that one of our competitors has got a big account in America, then hooray, because frankly, the more people there are out there exporting to the States, we export a lot to America, but we couldn't open the American market all on our own. Not only do we not have the supplies to do that, it would just be a bit weird. If you can imagine what it would be like, it was only one Australian wine on sale here. It wouldn't work. Yeah. So we encourage each other. We share information on things like how the American market operates. It's all public information. There's nothing secret about it. It's just short-circuiting people's efforts. What, of course, we don't talk about is things like market share or pricing or anything like that, because that wouldn't be right.
As a matter of interest, why the US specifically more than our neighbouring Europe?
Hattingley, and I'm sure all the others will probably have the same approach, naturally looks to Champagne and where the Champagne markets are. And why do we do that? Well, really because our closest competition is Champagne. We price against Champagne. Our quality is similar to Champagne. So it makes perfect sense to do that. Until recently, the largest market in the world outside France for Champagne was the UK, which was helpful. It's actually now the third largest, I think, or second largest outside Champagne. And the largest is now the United States. They've grown a lot. our market for champagne has actually shrunk slightly, largely as a result of the impact of Prosecco and Cava, although the English producers have had some effect. Even the Champenois would admit that. So why do we look at the US? It's a big market for champagne, and it's just a very big market anyway. And it's a very open market. The natural instincts of Americans are, if they see something on the shelf they haven't seen before, they'd like to try it. Now, if it's good enough, they'll come back. If it's not good enough, they won't come back. So it's a slightly do or die market. But that's fine, because we are good enough, and we do find people like it. So it's a whole mixture of reasons why the US is a good place to go to. Second one after that is actually Japan, surprisingly enough. That's the next biggest market for champagne. It's a huge market out there. And the Japanese are not quite so open to new things. They love things English and British. We have a reputation, I'm talking now generally, not just in the wine world, for very high quality products. And mostly, I think, deserved, the products that are sold in Japan. So you go to Japan with at least the buyers will have an open mind about it, but they recognize that persuading their consumers to convert is a harder job than it would be in, say, America or in the UK, because people would, as you said earlier, like to buy locally if they can. On the other hand, I think they will be a very big market for us. And once we are there will be a very loyal market. So they're well worth going for. And after that, it's Australia, surprisingly enough. We sell ourselves as British wine down there because the Australians see us as the British are their cousins, close historical connections, but the English are the bastards that beat us at rugby. Or not, as the case may be.
Absolutely. Who knows? Exciting to know that we've got that reputation and we're exporting to those markets, and even more exciting to know that none of them are in the EU, with all that's going on in the news at the moment and the challenges around the European Union. Exciting to know that we can and should be exporting globally, not just to our nearest neighbours.
Well, without wishing to make a rather obviously political point, I have to say that Brexit is, I'm sorry to use that word.
Don't worry, everybody is.
Everybody has to sooner or later. Brexit is kind of, I wouldn't say it's irrelevant to us, but it's not terribly important.
Good.
I wouldn't say that we don't export to the EU. Norway and Finland, of course Norway's not in the EU, but it's sort of halfway in, are good markets for us. Interesting that they are countries that don't produce their own wine, but they do have close affinities with the British. Spain, Italy, France, we don't export anything to at the moment anyway. I'm talking Hattingley now. I think there may be others in the industry who do, but again, I don't think they'll be exporting very much. Germany is an interesting one. They are very big drinkers of sparkling wine, sect in their case, of course. And we did finally manage, we've been trying to get into Germany for a long time. We finally managed at Hattingley to get an importer there who takes some volume. It's a sort of German equivalent of a place called Jack, which is a chain not dissimilar in some ways to Majestic, I suppose, for English listeners. Now, the reason I think we find France, Italy and Spain difficult is not the fact that they make sparkling wine. Of course, they all do. Not the fact, it's not prejudice or anything like that. It's the structure of their own internal markets. If you go to a restaurant in Provence, you will be offered Provençal wine. You won't be offered even Burgundy or Loire Valley or Bordeaux. There might be one on the wine list, but not much more than that. Usually. There are, of course, exceptions. So the idea of them putting an English sparkling wine on the menu is unthinkable.
Feels pretty remote.
Yeah. It feels remote. And certainly the French that come here, and we get quite a lot of French coming here, you'd be quite surprised, and a few Italians and Spanish too, particularly from the larger sparkling houses. They are very impressed by the quality of what we produce. So The EU is a rather difficult market for us. If anything, the issues surrounding the EU and Brexit for us, and I'm talking really now as an industry, although Hattingley is no different from anyone else in this respect, is more surrounding the need for labour. We rely on particularly Romanians to pick, but it's not just picking. If it was just that, yeah, maybe we could go without. But pruning vines in January is not something that's a particularly enjoyable experience, as you can imagine. More importantly, you actually need to know what you're doing. And there simply aren't the people in the UK, mostly, who do know, certainly aren't in the numbers, who could do that job and who want to do it. YGB is desperate to encourage people here to learn those skills, and we have an education and training committee which is devoted to trying to improve the education and training throughout the industry, and everything from pruning, picking, tying, bud rubbing, the other sort of more menial tasks in the vineyards, right the way through to managing a vineyard, to making wine, to selling it, researching. We encourage apprenticeships. So Hattingley couldn't make the government apprenticeship scheme work, for example, but we hired an apprentice just over 2 years ago. And in conjunction with the Vintners Company in London, which is one of the great livery companies in London, and the Wines and Spirits Education Trust, we trained her up. She was a graduate. She has now gone, we put her through a course at Plumpton, and she's now an assistant winemaker here and will remain. It was successful enough that other wineries want to follow on. The Vintners Company was very pleased with what happened, and we're hugely grateful for their support in this and in many other areas, actually. And we've had 2 more apprentices, the second of whom started beginning of this week, and the first one started about a month ago. And I'm sure we'll continue with that.
Amazing. I think it's exciting that we, in a world where it feels like every job is being replaced by an app on your phone at some point, it's nice to know that we can create new industries with proper careers and apprenticeships and a real structure, and develop people into something that is fascinating, and also something that we ultimately export. So yeah, it's good.
Well, I'm very keen on Hattingley, and this is partly my city experience, that people enjoy what they're doing, and that enjoyment, I think, comes from the job itself and a sense of satisfaction and interest. You've got to be interested, and the great thing about the wine industry is a lot of people are interested in it to begin with, but there's a lot to do. There are obviously quite a lot of fairly straightforward tasks, but as you rightly say, there are long-term careers here. And when we advertise for jobs, which we do fairly regularly, we very often get 50 or 100 applicants, mostly British, but we get them from all over the world as well. People do want to come and work here. And if you were an overseas qualified winemaker, I can well see why, because if you're an Italian, there you've got an industry that's very mature. Probably most of them are family-owned enterprises, so if you're not in the family, you're not going to go very far. Whereas here, you have a vibrant industry that's really beginning to spread its wings, expanding very rapidly. Opportunities, I wouldn't say endless, but there's huge numbers of opportunities in it.
And innovating, so learning new approaches and new techniques.
Absolutely.
I think if the government are listening, because the one thing that you've said, and it's the same in hospitality, and I hear the same things in education and in healthcare, is that need for a flexible workforce and that need for immigration. And whether it's within the EU or whether it's global, it doesn't matter. But when the government stand up and say, look, this is about immigration and we're closing our borders and we're not going to allow people in, that's ridiculous, because because there's so many industries in the UK that require that flexible workforce, and
That
in or out of EU, the conversation's got to be had that the workforce have got to come from somewhere. I don't know.
And in fairness to the government, I think they've been told it so many times by so many people, both in mainstream agriculture, if you like, as well as us, and in the hospitality industries, and in a number of others, actually. It's not just even those. And they've started listening, and I think this problem will be solved. I think realistically, we, as a country, we can't live without certainly temporary immigration. I mean, let's be honest about it. There was a seasonal agricultural workers scheme for 50 years where people were coming in quite regularly. And that was only abolished in about 2015, by memory, really very recently. They clearly didn't anticipate what was going to happen a year later.
Yeah. It's not an unsolvable problem.
It's not an unsolvable
for
problem.
Yeah.
And but we do it. I do the flexible workforce not because of what we want, although clearly that is helpful, but because I know from experience that when you're young, you want to have. I'm not talking about my personal desires when I was young. I'm talking about what I was told that youngsters wanted over the last 30 years. They don't want to be put in a box and told you'll do this for the rest of your life. They want to have interest and different things to do during their days and weeks at work. So, having people going around and doing different tasks is keeps their interest up. The other thing we do at Hattingley, which we're very keen on, is secondments. So we've seconded our winemakers in particular to wineries overseas. We've had one go to New Zealand, one to South Africa, one to Spain, one to Champagne, I think one or two others too. And the reason we do that is partly because when you're young, you want to travel, you want to see the world a bit. It's no bad thing for people to see how other people do things. They learn a bit. They sometimes come back realizing that actually the grass isn't quite as green as they thought it was on the other side of the fence, which is no bad thing either. But it's an experience that they enjoy, and that's only to be applauded.
Yeah, I think those summer jobs, I travelled through Australia 20 years ago and survived by working on various farms for a couple of months at a time, prawning gourmet tomatoes in the 40-degree heat, being paid by the metre. Good memories, but yeah, those jobs are great. And, again, in or out of Europe. That's a whole other debate.
It's not entirely altruistic. We gain from those secondments. Absolutely. And the most obvious case for us Hattingley, was we seconded someone to a place called Akarua down in New Zealand, which is a great little winery. It's not so little, it's bigger than us. And the winemaker came back and they made an ice-style wine. They couldn't call it an ice wine because ice wines, the grapes have to freeze on the vine and then be crushed, frozen on the vine. But in this country, as in New Zealand, temperatures don't get down low enough. So paradoxically, our rather ropey climate isn't ropey enough for that purpose. Whereas in Canada, of course, they do make some wonderful ice wine. But what they did in Akarua was to freeze the grapes, having picked them. And so we do that here. We call it, it's an ice wine style, but it's not actually true ice wine. But it tastes great. It's a dessert wine. It's very unusual. There's lots of other issues surrounding making it, but that's winemakers' secrets.
Yeah, excellent. Also, so we've spoken predominantly about sparkling. How are we getting on? Right early on in the conversation, you mentioned our poor reputation for kind of still wines and red wines. Are we making any inroads in that, or should we just focus on the sparkling variety?
Well, as chairman of WineGB, you'd never catch me saying that reputations of any of my colleagues' wines were poor.
This was a long time ago.
I said they had a certain reputation. But no, in fairness, the still wines of 30 years ago were, a lot of people regarded them as pretty poor.
Yes.
I think that's changing. It's going to take time, and it's changing for a number of reasons. First and foremost, we're simply becoming more experienced in making wine. We've got a much stronger cadre of professional winemakers in the UK who've been through Plumpton. They have much better equipment. It's no longer the preserve of people with an acre of vines who are doing it all themselves, who with the best will in the world can't have the equipment that they need to produce can't have the equipment they really need. It's not to say they can't produce some good wines, and some of them do very well, but it's all too easy not to. The second reason, I think, is that people are beginning to draw on the experience from sparkling wines and starting to use particularly Pinot Noir to make red wine. Now, that wasn't happening 30, 40 years ago, at least not on any scale at all, if at all. And you're beginning to see some quite some very respectable still red wines appearing, and still white wines, of course, as well. And I think that will will we ever be a still wine producer in bulk? Actually, I should say there are other varieties that people do use for still wine, things like Bacchus, which seems to do very well here as a varietal. And people produce some pretty respectable wines. They're different, which is no bad thing. They're very different, some of them, from imported wines. But as I say, it's no bad thing that. And the quality is definitely improving as we go along. I think one has to be realistic for the reasons we talked about earlier with sparkling wines and yield. It's always going to be a slightly challenging value proposition, I think. That said, the people who produce still, and Hattingley doesn't produce still wine, so I'm not really not as familiar with markets for that as I am for sparkling. They say that people buy their still wines very readily, and they come back for more every time. So who am I to doubt it?
Okay.
And as far as I'm concerned, as Hattingley and as WineGB chairman, the better they do, the better and happier I'll be.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. How far north can we grow at the moment? Are we growing across the whole country, or is this very much a southern England kind of domain?
It's not, but clearly southern England benefits from the best climate. So I think it's better put that there is more highly suitable land in the south of England than anywhere else. There are people growing grapes as far north as Yorkshire. One person actually tried in Scotland. I think he's stopped now. You have to remember it's not just how far north you are. There's a plus to going north, which is you get longer days in the summer, so more sunlight, but it is cooler. On the other hand, if you can find a microclimate where it's a bit warmer and you have longer days, then that might work. And I've never heard of anyone doing it, but I've always thought that I think it's Argyll, where the west coast of Scotland, where the Gulf Stream comes around and hits it, you'll get palm trees growing. As soon as you see palm trees growing somewhere in the UK, my immediate reaction is, I wonder. I'm not encouraging anyone to try, just to be clear, but I do wonder.
I don't know the easiest way of kind of sort of saying where we're at from a production-wise at the moment now, and what the trajectory is, whether that's number of bottles produced or acres, but both in Hattingley's terms and then UK-wise, what's our trajectory? What's the outlook for the next decade?
Glowing is probably the shortest way of putting it. Production and sales are both at Hattingley and at nationally are expanding at an extraordinarily rapid rate. You do have to remember that what in the sparkling world, and production is roughly 70% sparkling now across the country. And if anything, that percentage is growing. We, as WineGB, anticipate it will be over 90% within 5 to 10 years. So sparkling, we're selling what we made at least 3 years ago. And that's because the production process means that we have to keep the wine in bottle on its lees, in other words, with the yeast in it, for legally at least 8 months, or maybe 9 months. In practice, nearly everyone keeps it longer than that. And our Blanc de Blanc, for example, at Hattingley will be on lees for 4 to 5 years sometimes. So we've just released our 13. With that caveat, let me say where we are production-wise. Production in any given year is clearly huge for individual wineries, and indeed for the country, is a function very much of the weather in that year. But it's also a function, of course, of how much land is under vine, and that's been expanding very rapidly over the last few years. In 16, 17 and 18, we planted in aggregate in the country about 3 million vines. This year, we're anticipating another 2 million going in. And I see no reason why that is likely to slow down, particularly for the next few years. To put that in perspective, 5 million vines is probably, to vinify it, probably needs around 30 Hattingleys. So the issue that's confronting the industry will be winery capacity as much as anything. At Hattingley, we run our winery, so it's in what I would call a 100% year. It's full in a 100% year. Caused some problems in 18 when we had a 150% year because we had to scramble around to find temporary tanks. We had to buy an extra press. But that's good because in the long term it enhances our capacity. So in 2010, our first year, Hattingley made about 25,000 bottles. In 2018, we made 580,000. So you can see the growth has been substantial. In terms of the country, it's not quite that fast. In 2000, we don't really have very good figures going backwards because nobody was collecting them who had... there were 1 or 2 people collecting them, but the figures were privately produced for whatever reason, perhaps not the best they could be. Anyway, WineGB instituted a survey in 2018 of its members, and that suggested that in 2017 we made about 5.9 million bottles as a country, of which about 70% was sparkling wine. We didn't ask how much was actually sold, but we did ask it in the following year, which is the beginning of this year, in relation to the 18 year. Now, production in 2018 had expanded from 5.9 million bottles to 15.6 million. Now, that is a reflection to a large extent of the incredibly good year that we had in climate terms. But it also reflects, to a certain extent, the increased acreage under vine. Sales were probably about 3 million bottles, roughly. And that was, we expect that's going to expand pretty fast from here. Exports doubled from 4% to 8%. So it's a fast expanding industry at the moment.
That ability to flex the number of wines produced is just phenomenal, isn't it? So it is one of the issues that we're planting more vines, we're getting more acreage, but we don't have the wineries to actually process.
Correct. That's the problem. Now, it's not that figure that I gave of 30 new Hattingleys. To put that in perspective, there's probably only about 3 or 4 people who make wine for other people, of which we're one. Maybe a few more than that, but 3 or 4 of real scale. And some of the vines that have been planted will be committed to existing producers, but not all. And certainly if anyone listening is contemplating planting a vineyard, I wouldn't discourage them from doing so, but they do need to think about where they're going to get their wine made earlier in the piece rather than late. We have had people come to us at Hattingley about to produce their first grapes, relying on us to take their grapes, but not having told us that they were relying on us or even approached us. And of course, we're full. Yeah. Now, we obviously endeavour to help out as far as we possibly can. And if you're small, then it's a bit easier. But if you've got some of these people who've got 30 or 40 acres, which is 150 tons of grapes.
And what level of investment, if you had that, to build your own winery or boutique winery, I suppose, at that level, what sort of investment are you looking at? This is a big problem for them to overcome.
That's a really hard question because how can I put it?
A lot.
It's not cheap. It's certainly not cheap. It depends on, do you need a building? If you don't need a building, then that obviously reduces it substantially. How far do you want to go? Do you want to do, you're doing still or sparkling? If you're doing still, you need tanks. You're going to do your own bottling? Do you want a bottling line? Or are you going to hire one? So there's a huge number of variables in there.
Yeah.
It's not
I can see when they knock on your door. That would be much easier.
Exactly.
And then when you say planting 2 million new vines, what's the time before the first harvest? How long do they need to be in the ground before you can actually get
won't get your first harvest before the third year. And then it'll be a relatively small one. The fourth year, you'll get a better harvest, probably half to 2/3 of a normal yield. And then for the fifth year onwards, you should get full yield. But of course, depending on the weather.
Yeah,
and then you should get 30 years of top yield.
Okay.
25 to 30 years.
A decent return eventually. Just got to be patient.
Eventually.
To start with.
You've got to be patient.
It always blew my mind, but it takes 1,000 days to grow asparagus from seed, and then it's only in season for sort of, 10 weeks. But yeah.
Yeah, it was worth it when it gets there.
Lovely, yeah. New Forest asparagus. I absolutely love it.
I've grown my own in the past. It's fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah. We grew it. It took 3 years to grow, and then when it came out, it actually wasn't even that good, which was disappointing.
Oh, really?
But,
no, we didn't have that problem.
No, I'm not. I'm not much of a farmer. I'm much better at being in the kitchen than being on the land.
This was just a kitchen garden. It wasn't. We weren't doing it professionally.
I'm going to try again this year.
It's sad though when you get to the end of the asparagus season, you think, "Phew, thank goodness that stopped growing. I've had enough asparagus for this year."
Breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Yeah.
What's the impact on the environment? So this is obviously becoming an increasingly important thing with all businesses around, whether it's your packaging, how you transport it, how you grow it. I've got no idea in vineyards whether this is this good for the countryside, bad for the countryside. So my first question is around what's the impact? And secondly, being aware of that, is it different in the UK to the rest of Europe? Is there anything going on around the environmental aspects apart from food miles by buying British wine? Is there anything else we should think about?
Well, WineGB has just created a sustainability committee, which we hadn't had before, but quite a number of the vineyards have been looking at this individually and sharing information amongst themselves as to best practice here. And vineyards generally are quite good places for the environment. They although a lot of most vineyards in this country will use insecticides and herbicides to control the pests. In my view, we have to, but in fairness, there are some organic vineyards around, a couple of biodynamic ones even. But we have quite large headlands, which we basically cut. We don't really have to do much with those other than keep them mown, and they're pretty good environments. If you compare them to, and this is what I think you should probably be doing, is comparing them to arable fields where, yes, you'll get, and I speak as partly an arable farmer, you'll get headlands and strips around the side of environmental quality, but the centre of the field will be kept firmly under control. That's not the case with the vineyard, really. You've got, as I say, and the sprays tend to be more targeted. Here at Hattingley, we use tunnel sprayers. I'd like to say it was purely to make sure the spray doesn't go anywhere, but there's also a financial incentive to do it because we use 70% less spray by doing that. It collects it, and the spray only goes on the vines. It doesn't go anywhere else. So these grass strips between the two are quite sort of decent. So.
Okay.
And when you come into the wineries, I think there are some things we can do. Hattingley adopted solar power very early on, and we can't generate all the power we need because the presses and the tanks do use quite a lot. But we do generate what we can. We have a lot of waste comes out of the winery. We use about 7 litres of water for every litre of wine we make. And we have a system, we're way off the mains drains here. So we have our own system that takes in the waste, treats it, and it leaves us just pure water. It's a biobubble, a special environmentally sensitive system, which we follow. So, yeah, there are things that we can do.
Okay, thank you.
The biggest issue, funnily enough, is carbon dioxide, because fermentation naturally creates it. But we've never managed to find a system, and if there's any equipment manufacturer listening, if there's a decent system that allows us to collect the carbon dioxide that's created, I'm interested.
Yeah, that would make sense. We buy carbon dioxide for all of our beer.
Well, that's even worse. To add insult to injury, we buy carbon dioxide too, right. Because we have to keep the tops of the tanks oxygen free.
Same as with the beer. Yeah. That feels like there should be a solution there, doesn't it?
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah. Okay. Which bit of this overall industry, this overall business, then gives you the most pleasure, the most reward when you wake up in the morning and you think, this is a great day? What's the bit of it that really still excites you?
It's got to be harvest. Yeah. I mean, harvest is such an exciting time. The wineries are buzz with people, both the long-term employees. And one of the great things about this industry is we are creating rural employment in areas which really lost huge numbers with the decline in agricultural employment. For all good reasons, I quite understand. But we use a lot of people. And so, Hattingley employs about 20 full-time and probably another 20 full-time equivalents over the course of a year. But harvest you've got a mixture of the permanent staff for whom this is what they've been working for all year, and the temporary staff who come from all over the globe. Actually, we have lots of New Zealanders and Australians and Canadians, all sorts of people coming over, and English too. It's not entirely immigrant from that point of view. It's lovely watching them when they start the beginning of harvest. They're all sort of slightly quiet. They keep to themselves, and then they have lunch together and another lunch. By the end of harvest, they're all great mates. Tired, it's hard work, but they feel there's a good job well done, which is what normally happens.
How long is the harvest period?
It starts usually the last week in September through to the last week of October, even the first week of November. Again, it's dependent on the climate, of course. So 18, we actually started about 10 days to 2 weeks earlier and finished in the third week of October, which was unprecedented.
Wow. So amazing.
The staff start a little bit earlier and end a little bit later because there are things that have to be done post-harvest.
Well, as a man with a restaurant on the seafront, if we can have another year like last year's summer for May, June and July, I think we had 90 days pretty much of unbroken sunshine. I'll be very happy.
It was truly wonderful.
I'm sure it helps you out as well.
Absolutely.
You've been in business for a long time. You've been in the city. You've done traditional farming. You're now in winemaking. Is there any particular advice? I think we get asked a lot as business people, as entrepreneurs, for advice in business. Any advice you hear given out where you go, oh my God, that's nonsense. That's very academic. And in the real world, that doesn't apply. Or the flip side, any really good advice that you hear people being given or that you give to people who are interested in going into business, and particularly in anything to do with food and drink. But
I think probably believe in yourself as much as anything. There'll always be people that will tell you 10 reasons why something can't be done. And the staff here, my comment to them is sometimes has to be, don't tell me about the problems. There are no problems. There's only missing solutions. So come back to me with a solution. Not every business will succeed, of course. Do your planning. Try and look forward. Try and work out what you want to be. We had some basic ideas here when we started. The most important of which was we wanted it to be a commercial venture. It wasn't a hobby. But I had no idea it was going to grow to the scale it was going to grow. I thought it was going to be a small adjunct to the farm. But I learnt very quickly about, even then there was a shortage of winery capacity. and the market was growing rapidly. So do your homework.
Amazing. Well, congratulations on what you've achieved.
Thank you.
I think, are one of the reasons that we as Britain should be sort of more proud and stand more tall. The fact that we can come into a very old industry and innovate and do so well so quickly with that kind of trajectory of growth, I think is really exciting and this is the reason I do this podcast, is for people to understand who are sat in their restaurants and the bars, or even at home and just enjoying a glass of wine in the garden, is to know the amount of work and the amount of love and the amount of effort and the roller coaster of seasonality and the human beings that are involved behind our industry. I think is really exciting. So thank you for sparing the time. A quick one on what's next, and I think you've answered that with just you're going to be bloody busy by the sounds of it, but also where should people go if they want to buy your wine, or if they want to follow what you're up to and learn more? Where should they go?
Well, obviously you can get it from our website, hattingleyvalley.com or hattingleyvalley.co.uk, but we're also available in Ocado, Tesco's and Waitrose online.
Amazing.
That's the easiest. But there are a number of other, particularly locally, on local retailers and lots of hotels and restaurants that stock us too.
Excellent. Good for the UK wine industry to be getting into the supermarkets and having UK sparkling sat on the shelves where it deserves to be. So that's good.
Well, if you happen to be in America, you can buy us in Whole Foods, which is one of the biggest supermarkets over there, a really high quality one. Say in Germany, Jack's is the place to go. All in the fine wine sections.
Simon, thank you so much for sparing the time. Good luck in the future. It's been a real pleasure, and I look forward to watching the journey. Thank you.
Thank you.
So there you have it. You have reached the end of another episode of the Humans of Hospitality podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Please go and visit our website, humansofhospitality.co.uk, for the show notes and extra episodes and information. And whilst you're there, don't forget to sign up for our newsletter and to receive free materials all about the humans behind our incredible industry. Lastly, if you could subscribe, rate and review this podcast, you will be massively helping me out, and it would be hugely appreciated. Thank you so much. We'll be launching another podcast in just 7 days' time. Cheers.